If you look at the bottom of the page at the footnote related to Maslow's pyramid that was just mentioned, you'll see this explanation. The psychologist Abraham Maslow proposed a hierarchy of needs in the shape of a 5-level pyramid with survival needs at the bottom and self-actualization and self-transcendence at the top. According to Maslow, one must satisfy the needs at each level before moving up to the next. Basically, this hierarchy of needs describes like what every single human being needs to be successful, like emotionally and mentally and in life, etc. All right, back to the essay. When I was growing up in Calcutta, there was a boy who used to work in our house. His name was Nimai, and when he came to us, he must have been about 10 or so, just a little older than my brother and I. He'd been brought to our home by his uncle, who lived in our ancestral village and was a field laborer for my grandfather. The uncle explained to my mother that Nimai's parents were too poor to feed their several children, and while his older brothers were already working in the fields and earning their keep, Nimai was too frail to do so. My mother was reluctant to take on a sickly child who might prove more of a burden than a help, but finally she agreed, and Nimai lived and worked in our home for 6 or 7 years. My mother was a good employer. Nimai ate the same food that we children did, and was given new clothes during Indian New Year just as we were. In the time between his chores, dusting and sweeping, and pumping water from the tube well, and running to the market, my mother encouraged him to learn to read and write. Still, I would not disagree with anyone who says that it was hardly a desirable existence for a child. But what would life have been like for Nimai if an anti-child labor law had prohibited my mother from hiring him? Every year, when we visited our grandfather in the village, we were struck by the many children we saw by the mud roads, their ribs sticking out through the rags they wore. They trailed after us, begging for a few pays. Sorry, guys, I totally mispronounced that. It's not pays, it's paise. That's the smallest unit of Indian currency, worth a fraction of an American penny. That footnote you'll find at the bottom of the page on page 400. When the hunger was too much to bear, they stole into the neighbors' fields and ate whatever they could find: raw potatoes, cauliflower, green sugarcane, and cornstalk, even though they knew they'd be beaten for it. When Nimai passed these children, he'd always walked a little taller, and when he handed the bulk of his earnings over to his father, there was a certain pride in his eye. Exploitation, you might be thinking, but he thought he was the responsible member of his family. A bill like the one we've just passed is of no use unless it goes hand in hand with programs that will offer new life to these newly released children. But where are the schools in which they are to be educated? Where is the money to buy them food and clothing and medication so that they don't return home to become the extra weight that capsizes the already shaky raft of their family's finances? Their own governments, mired in countless other problems, seem incapable of bringing these services to them. Are we in America who, with one blithe stroke of our congressional pen, rendered these children jobless, willing to shoulder that burden? And when many of these children turn to the streets, to survival through thievery and violence and begging and prostitution, as surely in the absence of other options they must, are we willing to shoulder that responsibility? Guys, note the use of all of those rhetorical questions meant to imply the obvious. No, we really aren't prepared for all of that. So then we need to come up with another solution. That's what's being implied here.